October's podcast episode will start in just a moment, but I'm just interrupting first because me and Freya would like to tell you that Creepy Classics is now a book, in case you missed it or if you're new to the channel. Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, collects 12 stories originally featured on the Creepy Classics podcast, and there is one 13th book exclusive story. So even if you've listened to every episode, there is still something new to read in here. It is available now as an ebook or a paperback from Amazon. So if you are in the mood for something spooky and a little bit different, a little bit Roman, pick yourself up a copy for Halloween. Good girl, Freya. Good girl, Freya. Good girl, Freya.
Orestes in Tauris. Orestes' hand slipped on wet stone as he leaned on the wall to round the corner, and it felt like blood. The sight of his mother's blood on his hands flashed across his vision, and he stopped to catch his breath. The sound of the wind whipping across the hillside became the sound of her screams, and the smell of the winter rain became tainted with the coppery tang of her open wounds. A warm hand on his arm pulled him back to the present. Pylades stood, quiet, holding him gently. Orestes took a deep, shuddering breath and carried on. He was relieved to discover that the shrine of the oracle herself was only about halfway up the mountain, the path winding on up to the racetrack far above their heads. The outer court was filled with statues that had been dedicated by other visitors to the oracle over the years, statues of Apollo, of Victory, and of other gods and goddesses, Poseidon, Artemis, and Zeus. The temple itself was brightly painted, and carved with images of Artemis and Zeus, Dionysus, and, of course, Apollo, the object of all this worship, adoration, and fear. Orestes walked past a carving of Apollo killing the giant serpent, the python, in this place long ago. He heard a hissing sound, and felt something leathery slip across the bared tops of his feet. When they reached the altar outside the temple, Orestes performed the sacrifice himself. With so much human blood on his hands, why be squeamish about one more pig? Sacrifice done and consultation tax paid, they were allowed to consult the oracle herself. A robed priest was waiting for them at the door of the temple between its tall painted pillars. Before allowing them to enter, he pointed up at the signs inscribed over the entrance, "Nothing in excess" and "Know yourself." Orestes nodded silently. He knew himself only too well. As he went through the door, he started and snatched his head to look behind him. He thought he had felt a snake hissing at his elbow, its tongue licking the goose pimples on his skin. But when he turned around, there was nothing there. It took a few moments for his eyes to adjust to the torch-lit dimness inside. The walls were lined with more offerings to the god. Bronze cauldrons, bronze statues of bulls and charioteers, and gold tripods. Looming over it all were statues of two of the Fates, but the third had been replaced by the huge shapes of Zeus and of Apollo himself. In the very centre of the room was a stone, standing to about waist height, in the shape of a beehive. It was covered with carvings that looked like a knotted net. "The Omphalos," breathed Pylades, coming to stand next to Orestes. "The centre of the whole world." There was awe in his voice. "I thought it was supposed to be the world's navel. Doesn't look much like a belly button," muttered Orestes. Pylades ignored him. Orestes walked over to the stone and ran his hand along it. A bright red stain shimmered in the wake of his hand, and faded again. Two more priests appeared, and gestured to Orestes and Pylades to follow them. They were brought to a pair of wooden benches set deep into the temple, next to a closed-off room with a wooden slatted door on it. This was the Sanctum Sanctorum, the innermost shrine of the temple. Two men sat fidgeting on the bench on the right, glancing up towards the door of the innermost sanctuary before looking down at their feet or whispering quietly to each other. Pylades and Orestes took seats on the left bench opposite them. A sweet smell drifted out from the dark interior of the sanctuary, wafting towards them all on a current of warm air. Orestes could not quite place the smell, which was not quite like incense, and not quite like a rich, expensive perfume, and yet also very like both. It made him feel giddy and light-headed. Then he heard a low, moaning sound, the sound of a woman chanting something or saying something in a low voice. Most of it sounded like gibberish, but he could make out words every now and then. Words like Italy, sea journey, and great future, not yet. Orestes peered towards the sacred space, trying to see inside. He could just about make out, through the slats in the wood, the shape of a woman seated on some kind of high stool, holding a laurel wreath in one hand and swaying about as she muttered, shouted, and whispered all in turns. After a little while, the woman stopped speaking at all, and 3 priests quietly opened the wooden door and went into the sanctuary. Orestes could no longer see the woman as she was blocked by the men standing around her, and they all had an intense whispered conversation from which he could make nothing out. Eventually, the 3 priests came out and stood in front of the little wooden door and turned to the men sitting on the opposite bench. "It will be better for you to found the colony," one of the priests told the men. "Your future and your children's children's future will be bright. Go." One of the men looked relieved and smiled. The other looked apprehensive. They both thanked the priests profusely and were gently steered out of the temple and towards the priest outside who could take new offerings for the god and them. The 3 priests who were consulted with the priestess turned now to Orestes and Pylades to ask them why they were here and what they wanted to ask the oracle. Orestes opened his mouth to speak, but the words froze in his throat. He gagged. "This is Orestes, the son of Agamemnon," Pylades told the priests. Orestes heard a sharp intake of breath from inside the secret shrine. He felt movement behind him. The sound of hissing grew at his feet. "King Agamemnon has been dead these many years," one of the priests said. "We hear his widow Clytemnestra recently perished too," added another, the question hesitant in his tone. "Yes," said Orestes. A shadow passed over his head, and he felt his hands shaking in his lap. The smell of blood hung in the air. His hand wanted to rise up and down in a stabbing motion. He shifted to sit on it, to keep it still. "How did she die?" demanded another priest, as if they had not heard the rumours, as if they did not know. Orestes could not say it. "Orestes did his duty as a son and avenged his father," Pylades said for him. "The queen Clytemnestra, and her lover too, died at his hands." "And what do you ask of the great god Apollo?" asked the 3rd priest. "Salvation," said Orestes. The door to the inner shrine opened slowly. An elderly woman stood in the dark shadows of the room within a room, a single oil lamp lighting her face from underneath. Her dress was long and shimmered slightly in the flickering light, and she wore her veil loosely over her grey hair. She looked toward Orestes and her eyes widened. She raised a shaking hand to point to a space over his shoulder. Orestes turned and found his face pressed close up against the monstrous image of his mother. Her insubstantial features were pressed close up against his. Her eyes were wide as they had been when she was in her death throes, and blood dribbled from her mouth, which was wide open and snarling. She reached out cat-like clawed hands towards him, grabbing at him, though her dead and bodiless grip could not get a hold on him. "Wake up!" she hissed, and although she was looking at Orestes, she seemed to be addressing something behind her. "Wake up and do your duty! This boy I carried and birthed, this boy for whom I endured sickness and pain and endless sleepless nights, this boy ended me." He saw the ghoul raise its eyes to look directly at the terrified priestess, who stood trembling with her back against the wall of her sacred chamber. "Do you know what they told him in Athens?" the monster screeched. "Did he tell you what they told him? That he was right." It laughed then, with no mirth. "The father is the true parent," they said, as if his father wrecked his body, tore apart his most private parts, and gave up his very life force to nourish him. "The father is the true parent, the mother merely soil. The mother killed the father, so the mother had to die. His vicious murder of me was the right thing to do." The thing moved around him, getting closer to the priestess. Orestes sank to his knees on the floor, but it carried on screaming relentlessly. "No mention of the crime that started it all," it complained, "the most despicable of all. The sacrifice of his own daughter, necessary, he said, so he could go and fight his brother's war. Killing for the sake of more killing. This ingrate cares nothing for his sister, my first little baby, my shadow, my daughter. Father matters, war matters. Mother, sister, daughter, we mean nothing. Will you really help him, woman?" The priestess did not answer. Furies! The spectre that had once been his mother turned to the dark space behind, where Pylades still sat on the bench, immobile. You can see this weak toy of men will be of no help to us. Avenge us, goddesses of the underworld! Avenge my daughter and avenge me! A renewed hissing sound swept across the floor towards the spot where Orestes hunched. From out of the shadows came figures that looked like women wearing long black mourning robes. But these were not women. Their faces looked like the caricatures of comedic theatrical masks. Their bodies, arms and hair were entwined with serpents, and great black shadow wings dripping fire and blood sprouted from their backs. They closed in on Orestes, who buried his head in his arms and wept. Enough, declared one of the priests. What is this man doing? The question was addressed to Pylades, but the oracle answered. Can you not see them? She asked. Can you not see the creatures attacking him? No one can, Pylades confirmed. He screams and he cries out that his mother is here, or the Furies are clawing at him, surrounding him, strangling him with the deadly vipers that swarm all over their bodies. But no one else can see a thing. I can, said the priestess. I will consult the god and find a way to help you. Iphigenia stood on the cliff's edge and looked down to the black depths of the swirling sea below her. She lifted a foot briefly, and her toes hovered just over the drop. She put her foot back down on solid ground. As the sun moved across the sky, the shadows from the Taurians' grisly trophies passed across her face. The decaying heads of Greeks and strangers alike, shipwrecked men who thought they had found salvation, stared down at her from on top of their tall, bloodied poles. They were always so relieved when they saw her, so happy to be met with kindness and have their hair washed and their bodies cleansed. And then she sent them all in, one by one, to the dark temple. And when she saw them again, they were a head glaring down reproachfully from above, their bodies flung from the cliff top into the sea. Last night she had dreamed of home again. It was the same dream, always the same dream, more a memory than a fantasy. She was at home with her mother, preparing for her wedding. It was a bittersweet moment, knowing she would be parted from her mother, but she was excited too as they dressed her in her flower crown and yellow veil and sang wedding songs. Her baby brother toddled up to her, chubby arms out, but she was worried his grubby little hands and his mouth stained with berry juice would ruin her dress, and she would not touch him. Sometimes in her dreams she came so close to changing her mind, to just lifting up the little boy and giving him a kiss and a cuddle, holding him one last time, but she never quite could. Her arms would get just within reach of his, and she would wake up. But last night was one of the darker dreams, the memory of the journey to the strange nighttime wedding ceremony, the grim faces of all the men around her, and the growing realization that there were no women there. The tears running down Achilles' face as he led her to the altar. Then the memories and the dreams became disjointed, hands pulling at her, her father telling them no, she was a good girl, she did not need to be bound, wondering if she should try to run, seeing men carrying swords and knowing she would not get far, the cold stone of the altar on her back as she was laid down across it, and the feeling of water sprinkled across her face like raindrops. Her father taking his knife and roughly cutting off a chunk of her hair, throwing it on the small fire. Then he raised his knife again, and suddenly all the torches were extinguished and the fire put out, everything went dark and she was rolled off the altar while her father cried out, "See how the gods shroud this terrible sacrifice in darkness! See what I am willing to do, men, for our campaign! Killing my own daughter, an act so appalling the gods themselves do not want to witness it!" Seeing Odysseus holding a thick blanket of the type that will put out a fire, being rolled away across sharp stones and battered against every rock on the ground and bundled into a cart, then covered with hay and sheep dung. The priest whispering one brief message in her ear as he shoved her down into the shit. "Your father loves you." Everything after that was just a blur, a long journey to this strange land, to be greeted by those hollow, staring heads and sent to this grim temple to serve, to pay for her upkeep and her life. The dreams usually did not go that far. They stopped on that one last message. Your father loves you." "Greek!" snapped a sharp voice from behind her. "Two of your people have landed on the beach. They are to be brought to you for cleansing before the sacrifice. Come." Iphigenia followed her Taurian master down the rocky slope towards the beach. They came to a small sandy area and a rocky cove, a cave in the cliffs tucked into the back of the bay. A Taurian cattle herder had taken his herd down to the shore to wash them in the crashing waves between the rocks. On the other side of the bay sat two young Greek men. They were dusty and dishevelled from travelling, huddled together under a cloak. They seemed to be dozing, but suddenly one of them jumped up and cried out, a wordless wail of terror and despair. While the other stirred and blinked sleep out of his eyes, the first drew his sword and raced across the bay to fling himself at the cattle, stabbing the poor beasts in the sides and in the belly. Gripped by some kind of battle frenzy, he was screaming out nonsense. "Look, Pylades, look! They are here again! They have followed us all the way here across the ocean! There are more of them than ever! And their snakes are sliding across the sand to strangle me! My mother is with them, reaching out her hands to scratch and claw at me, grabbing stones and rocks to hurl at me! The priestess was wrong. Coming here has done nothing. There is no escape. Not now, not ever." The one called Pylades, properly roused now, leapt up and rushed to his companion's side. He grabbed at the other's flailing hands, wrenched the sword from him and flung it to the ground, and pulled his companion into a tight embrace, pinning his arms and comforting him with his body at the same time. The cattle herders started to pelt the pair of them with stones, trying to protect their cows, and Pylades pulled his cloak over them both to try to protect them. He said nothing, but pulled the other's head down onto his shoulder, and both wept as the cow's blood dripped and pooled around their feet. The Taurian watchmen emerged from under the cliffs, swords drawn, and the cattle herders stepped back. Iphigenia drew herself up tall, steeling herself to do her job. The watchmen stepped slowly towards the two Greeks. "We are going to die, Pylades," said the angry and bloodied man, calmer now. He pulled away from his companion a little and picked up his sword from where it lay on the sand. "And I am ready for it, because I can't live like this anymore." His whole body was shaking, but he held his sword high, the sunlight sparkling off the blade as it quivered in the air. Pylades nodded and the two turned to face the watchmen. But they were denied their chance to go out in a blaze of glory. The Taurian watchmen knew what they were doing, and the Greeks were bruised, battered, and exhausted. While they swung their swords wildly at their opponents, the Taurians wanted to keep them for their goddess, and did not even try to wound them with their blades. They focused entirely on knocking the strangers' swords out of their hands and getting them beaten down onto the ground, where the two huddled together on their knees, clasping each other's hands tightly as they were tied with rope, hauled to their feet, and marched up the rocky path to the temple up above. Iphigenia followed, offering up silent prayers to whatever god or goddess might be listening, that their end would at least be merciful. They reached the blood-stained altar on the cliff top, and the watchmen left to return to the king's palace, while the priests went inside the temple to prepare themselves. Iphigenia was left alone to cleanse and prepare the victims for the sacrifice outside. She did not dare untie them, but she washed their cuts and bruises as gently as she could, and cleaned and oiled their hair while they sat, silent and defeated, on the rocks. The one whose name she did not know looked strangely familiar, though she could not quite place why. "May I ask your name, Greek?" she said to him. He was silent. "I am sorry," said Iphigenia, inadequately. "You have come a long way for nothing, I think. You must have heard the stories about what they do to Greeks in this place. Why did you come here?" Again, both men were silent. "Where do you come from?" Iphigenia tried again. Perhaps trying to get her to stop talking, Pylades answered briefly, "Mycenae." "Mycenae!" cried Iphigenia. "You are really from Mycenae? What is happening there? Are the king and queen well? Did the king get to fight his war? Did he win? What about the prince, Orestes? How old is he now? He must be 20 years old at least." She saw the two men look at each other, startled. It seemed that she finally had their attention. While she was waiting for them to speak, something else started to happen. The wind on the cliff top picked up, not unusual, but it carried on it a scent that was incredibly familiar to her, from her memories, or maybe just from her dreams. It was some kind of woman's perfume. But then it faded, and she thought she heard a bird-like cackling, and she could almost smell smoke. There was a rustling at her feet, like the hissing of snakes. "Are you from Mycenae?" asked Pylades. "Yes," said Iphigenia. "I came from there long ago. Please tell me, are the king and the queen and the prince well?" The other man cleared his throat, and when he spoke, he was hesitant, unwilling. "I am sorry, woman, as you seem to have known them. The king and queen are both dead." Iphigenia dropped the expensive oil she was holding, and the jar smashed on the stony ground. She ignored it. "Both of them?" she said. The man nodded yes. The queen murdered the king herself, along with her lover, to avenge her daughter. Iphigenia could not speak. Her throat closed up and she could barely breathe, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat down hard on a rock, and she only became aware that she was crying when she realized her tears were dripping into her lap. "She did it for her daughter? Iphigenia?" she said. Both men nodded yes. Iphigenia let out a wail of anguish. Pylades looked around as if worried that she might draw attention, but she often performed funeral dirges for the men she prepared for the sacrifice, and no one took any notice. "What happened to the queen?" Iphigenia eventually gasped out through her sobs. "I killed her," said the unknown Greek, "to avenge my father." Iphigenia blinked through her tears and pushed her hair out of her face to stare at him. She squinted, trying to imagine his handsome, chiseled features if they were chubby and rounded, and what his face would look like if he were smiling. "Orestes?" she said, shakily. He nodded yes. Iphigenia was about to open her mouth to tell him who she was, when all three of them were caught up in a sudden whirlwind that spun around them, leaves and dust swirling in their faces and in their hair. Iphigenia saw glimpses of horrible things through the dust and shadow, grinning bird-like faces with dark black wings dripping blood, female creatures with snakes crawling through their hair and across their bodies, and coming through them the shape of a woman, ghoulish, bloodied, hands raised, her eyes popping from her face and blood dripping from her mouth. But then the whirlwind died down, and with a flick of her hand, the woman thing dismissed the other creatures. They retreated howling and dissolved into the air above the sea. The woman herself walked towards Iphigenia, where she stood next to her bound victims. The woman's eyes retreated into her face into a more normal position. She lowered her hands, and the bloodstains faded from her face and clothes. Her hair rearranged itself into an elaborate and beautiful style, and gold jewellery appeared around her neck and dangling from her ears, a queen's jewellery. "Mother?" said Iphigenia and Orestes at the same time. The figure had eyes only for Iphigenia. She smiled and nodded yes, and opened her arms out wide. Iphigenia did not hesitate. She flung herself into the phantom's embrace, her mother's touch as light as air, like a warm breeze on her arms and around her shoulders. The echo of her mother stepped back and looked into Iphigenia's eyes. "It was all for you, my darling," she said. "If you are well, then I can rest." The ghostly queen raised her eyes to look at her son, standing behind Iphigenia, silent and still. "Take your sister home," said Clytemnestra to her son. "Take her home and keep her safe, and there will be no need for vengeance any more." Orestes, dumbstruck, stared at them both. "Iphigenia," he said, "is that really you?" "A father could not really bring himself to kill me," she said. "He made a show for his men so they would believe the gods were on their side in the war, and had me sent away here." Orestes almost smiled for a moment, his love for his father justified. If his mother had any feelings of guilt about her murder of her husband, she did not show it. She was focused entirely on her daughter. With the lightest touch of a kiss on Iphigenia's cheek, the spectral queen melted away. Iphigenia desperately wanted to give her little brother the hug that she had waited for so many years to give, but the priests would be coming for them, and she could not waste time. Grabbing one of the ceremonial knives from the altar, she cut the ropes holding Orestes and Pylades and held the knife up, turning to the 3 slaves that were with them. "Come with us, or fight us," she said. As one, they agreed to come. "I know a fisherman with a boat who will do anything for me," said one, a girl who had worked closely and just as reluctantly with Iphigenia for many years. "Take us to him," said Iphigenia, and all 6 hurried away down the rocky path towards the sea. The Phantom Queen watched them go, with the shadow of a tear in her eye. The end. Welcome back to Creepy Classics. I'm Juliet Harrisson, and this is my podcast retelling and discussing ancient, medieval, and early modern ghost stories, with new episodes every 2 months. And before we get into this year's Halloween episode, I first have to make a very exciting announcement. Creepy Classics is now a book! Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, is a collection of 13 short stories that are retold or reimagined from ancient Roman ghost stories. Some of them are from poems and plays, some of them are from histories and folklore. It's a variety. 12 of the 13 stories in the book have been featured on the podcast, but there is one book-exclusive story, the story of Agrippina's ghost and Nero, which is called Dies Irae, and that one is exclusive to the book only. So if you want to read all of the stories, then the book is the only way to do that. The other 12 have all featured on the podcast. The book is available now from Amazon in either ebook or paperback format. And just be aware, if you want the paperback, you will need to go through your own country's Amazon site in order to get it. If you have Kindle Unlimited, it is available on Kindle Unlimited, so you can read it for free. It also goes rather well with this month's episode, because I made quite a few references to Orestes and to the Furies in that book-exclusive story Dies Irae, which has similar subject matter, although Dies Irae is based on actual real people, and this one is mythology. This story is inspired by Aeschylus' play Eumenides and Euripides' Iphigenia in Tauris. The title of Aeschylus' Eumenides is another name for the Furies or Erinyes. These are the monstrous creatures who kind of enact vengeance and justice, but particularly vengeance, because Nemesis would be the goddess connected with justice a bit more. Eumenides is the last of a trilogy of plays. Agamemnon, the first play in the trilogy, is about Clytemnestra murdering Agamemnon in vengeance for her daughter Iphigenia, whom Agamemnon had sacrificed 10 years earlier so he could get the right wind to go to Troy and fight the Trojan War. This is a very long and complicated story. It was a real challenge trying to boil it down to the essentials for this story. Then the second play, Libation Bearers, is about Orestes and his other sister Electra murdering Clytemnestra in order to avenge Agamemnon, because Agamemnon is their father. Then in Eumenides, Orestes is being pursued by the ghost of his mother, Clytemnestra, and by the Furies because he has committed matricide. And in Eumenides, Orestes is eventually set free from being chased by his mother's ghost and the Furies, on the basis that I mentioned in the story, that mothers are just soil and the father is the true parent, which means the father is more important, and therefore he was right to murder his mother in order to avenge his father. Euripides' Iphigenia in Tauris has quite a different take on the story. In that play, the Furies have continued to chase Orestes. They obviously didn't think that was a reasonable enough reason to let him off. And Iphigenia turns out to be alive after all. In the play, Iphigenia has been saved by Artemis, not by Agamemnon. I changed it because I wanted all of the action to be human. Obviously, there's ghosts and there's Furies in my story, but I didn't want the kind of god mechanics of Greek myth. That wasn't the type of story I wanted to tell, where the gods just swoop in and do something. Because in the play, Artemis has literally just kind of swooped in and removed Iphigenia at the last moment and substituted a deer, and Agamemnon thinks he's killed Iphigenia, but he's actually killed a deer. I wanted my story to be primarily human. Clytemnestra is kind of controlling the Furies, which is something she does in Aeschylus' play as well. But other than that, everybody is a human, whether they are a dead human or a live human. And I wanted that more human aspect. I also emphasised the priestess at Delphi helping Orestes more than the god. Obviously, it's the god Apollo who speaks through the priestess at the oracle at Delphi. And in Greek myth, it's Apollo who sends Orestes and Pylades to Tauris. They're actually sent there to steal a statue. The Taurian goddess that the Greeks identified with Artemis. They're supposed to steal a statue of her, and at the end of the play, Iphigenia and Orestes and Pylades managed to steal the statue and get away. And the statue is this kind of MacGuffin, and it was Apollo who told them to get it. And I wanted to focus on it as a ghost story. That's the theme of this podcast. And it's Halloween, so we want something that's a spooky ghost story rather than a kind of adventure story chasing after a MacGuffin. And I wanted to emphasise human agency, although I've implied that the priestess did have some kind of divine knowledge that Iphigenia was there. That's kind of the implication. I didn't really spell it out, but that was my thinking, that the priestess has some divine knowledge from the gods, that if they go to Tauris, they will find Iphigenia, and that will therefore placate the ghost of Clytemnestra. That was the idea. I don't know how well that came across, but that was the idea. So I have implied that the priestess has some kind of supernatural knowledge, but that she's decided what to do with it, as opposed to Apollo just telling them what to do. And I've messed around with the timeline as well, because I've set all of this after Orestes' trip to Athens, whereas in Aeschylus' play they go to Delphi first, and yeah. My description of consulting the oracle at Delphi draws on mostly Plutarch on the decline of oracles, which he wrote in the end of the first, beginning of the 2nd century CE, Roman period, but Plutarch is Greek, and he was a priest of Delphi, so presumably he knew what he was on about. I've also drawn on Pausanias' description of Greece, which is again 2nd century CE, so they're a lot later. I've also deliberately described a somewhat simpler version of Delphi than they describe, because this story is set very, very early. Delphi became the most famous oracle in Greece, and there's all these treasuries where various cities have sent all these gifts to Delphi and stuff, and I've not described much of that, because this is meant to be an earlier version of the temple and a simpler version. And I've also put the omphalos, the belly button of the world, the stone that marked Delphi, as the centre or belly button of the world. I've put that in the centre of the temple. It was probably in the aditon, the innermost sanctuary, but I've moved it to somewhere Orestes and Pylades can see it, basically. The phrase sanctum sanctorum is, of course, Latin, not Greek, but I figured it is more recognisable to English speakers than the Greek equivalent would be, and it means Holy of Holies. And obviously I've changed little bits and pieces so the story works. So weddings did not normally take place at night, as far as I know, although they could have done. But I needed a way for humans to be able to save Iphigenia, so under cover of darkness seemed to make sense. She has a dream in Euripides' play Iphigenia and Tauris, but it's a symbolic dream that makes her think Orestes is dead. Whereas here, I needed a way to incorporate a flashback. Like, one of the biggest challenges of this story is it's this huge, complicated mythic cycle that the Greek audience would have known and that gets spelled out in the plays in a not entirely kind of dramatically satisfying way sometimes. So I gave her flashbacks as a dream to be able to include that information in the story, basically, and to cover what happened to her and explain what happened to her. I wrote as if Orestes and Pylades were lovers. I don't think I actually made it explicit anyway. I kind of felt like injecting a bit of romance, but then there wasn't really a way to explicitly incorporate that. I've tried to imply it. In the sources, they're really, really good friends, and Pylades is married to Orestes' other sister, Electra. But in ancient Greek culture, that wouldn't stop them having a love affair with each other anyway. And although a lot of ancient Greek male-male relationships were an older man and a younger man, there is evidence for relationships of men of about the same age too. It's not something that you would be an outcast for, and it's certainly not against any rules or laws. You might be a bit frowned upon for having two men of the same age together, but it's not a massive deal. So it was a plausible fit, and I just thought it would be kind of nice, but then I couldn't work out a way to make it more explicit without getting in the way of the rest of the story and the relationships between Orestes, Iphigenia and Clytemnestra, which are really the main point. Tauris is Crimea, and the Tauri later intermarried with Scythians, but at this point the Taurians are a separate group, and they are described by a few ancient Greek sources. The Taurian goddess was identified with the goddess Artemis by the Greeks, so they just describe the goddess that Iphigenia is preparing these foreigners for sacrifice to, for this human sacrifice. The plays just call her Artemis. Now, in real life, presumably it wouldn't be Artemis, it would be a Taurian goddess and the Greeks would go, oh, that goddess is similar to Artemis. Maybe she's also a virgin or also connected with hunting or something. And they would go, oh, well, that must be what they call Artemis. And they would just assume it's Artemis. The Taurians are described by Herodotus, who outlines this practice that Euripides is referring to in his play. Herodotus, in his histories, says, all shipwrecked men and any Greeks whom they take in their sea raiding, they sacrifice to the virgin goddess. After the first rites of sacrifice, they smite the victim on the head with a club. According to some, they then throw down the body from the cliff where their temple stands and impale the head. Others agree with this as to the head, but say the body is buried. And the goddess to whom they sacrifice is said by the Tauri themselves to be Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia. So there's obviously a really interesting link between Iphigenia and Artemis and human sacrifice and this temple in Tauris with this human sacrifice ritual going on. And it's all got kind of mixed up in the telling and the retelling, and the Greeks understanding everything in their own Greek terms and the Taurians doing their thing, and it's all kind of got mushed up together. Herodotus also says they cut off their enemies' heads and stick them on poles by their homes as well. They appear to be a fairly violent culture in this period. Ancient animal sacrifice was usually done outside of temples. Euripides implies that this Taurian human sacrifice happens inside, but he also says the blood-stained altar is outside. So basically, Euripides doesn't really know. Euripides has never been to Tauris. For all we know, they might not have done this at all, and it might just be rumours and exaggerated stories that reach the Greeks. Who knows? But Euripides is kind of describing things the way he knows them, which is to have the altar outside the temple, and that's where you perform animal sacrifice, and then you can have like channels to get rid of the blood and so on. But he also needs, for the purposes of his play, he needs Iphigenia and Orestes and Pylades to be standing outside the temple by themselves. So he implies that the sacrifice happens inside the temple. So he doesn't really know. He's just making it all up, same as the rest of us. I've talked about the oracle at Delphi before in the episode on the hero at Temesa, where we also had a visit to the Delphic oracle. It has, as well as the omphalos stone, the belly button, it also has know yourself and nothing in excess written above the entrance, the famous Delphic maxims. It's famous for telling the king Croesus that he would destroy a great empire, and Croesus did not realise it meant his and not his opponents. It's also famous for telling the Athenians to use wooden walls in their war against the Persians, which Themistocles then interprets as meaning ships as opposed to wooden fencing, and is proved correct. There's a lot of debate over whether the oracle, the woman who the god speaks through, is breathing in vapours from natural gases or something else or nothing. There might be some fault lines leading to hallucinogenic fumes, but that's the source of a lot of debate. I've sort of implied that might be the case here, or it could be man-made fumes. Plutarch definitely describes the sweet smell that's a bit like incense that comes from the innermost sanctuary. So there's something, whether they're just burning incense, which they could be, or there's some kind of natural gas, or they're burning something that has an effect on the Pythia, that, a plant, a drug of some kind. It's hard to say. I have actually been to Delphi a very, very long time ago, and I remember how steep the mountainside is. It's on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. It's a very steep mountainside. We walked all the way up to the racetrack because Delphi was also the site of a series of athletic games similar to the Olympics, the Pythian Games that were held every 4 years, just like the Olympics. And like the Olympics, they were open to all Greeks, but no non-Greeks. So there's a racetrack quite high up the mountainside. You get quite worn out just walking to it. It's a huge site, but obviously we're focused for this episode on the Temple of Apollo itself. And the Furies, or Eumenides, or Erinyes, was said to have sprung from the blood of Uranos, or Uranus, when he was castrated by his son Kronos. This is the mythology around the earlier generations before the Olympian gods. Zeus is the son of Kronos. The Furies tortured criminals in the underworld, and they haunted and chased wrongdoers, especially murderers and children who hurt their parents in the upper world. And they either wore long black robes like mourners or short skirts like huntresses or like Artemis. So I've taken my description of the Furies from Greek vases and from Euripides' description where Orestes is yelling out about what's attacking him, and he mentions fire and blood dripping from their wings. That detail comes from Euripides. And then you see lots of images of them with snakes. And I gave them the black mourning robes rather than the short skirts just because that kind of fitted the tone quite well. If you would like to read either of the plays, you can get really good, up-to-date modern translations for free from poetryintranslation.com. So that's Aeschylus Eumenides and Euripides Iphigenia in Tauris. You can read Herodotus and Plutarch at Lacus Curtius, the gateway to ancient Rome. And you can read Pausanias' description of Greece at theoi.com. I also use theoi.com for descriptions of the Furies and images, lots of vases with images of the Furies. I had a look at various recreations of the Temple of Delphi and descriptions and videos of the site, also partly because I haven't been there in a long time, so to remind myself what it looks like and where it is, and I just kind of browsed YouTube for that. And I had a look at the Wikipedia pages on Chersonesus, I'm not sure the pronunciation, in Ukraine, which is a Greek site where Tauris would have been in the ancient world, in Crimea, and on the Taurians. I also used a lot of Oxford Reference Online for, again, all these little details, like exactly how would they carry out an animal sacrifice, the sprinkling of water on the animal's head to make it look like it's nodding yes to agree to the sacrifice. That was a particularly grim detail. I don't have as many recommendations for more in-depth academic work on the subject as usual because a lot of it actually just came from my own general knowledge. I obviously looked up those details on those various sites and so on, and I read the primary sources again. But a lot of the kind of general context is just my own kind of general knowledge and many, many years' work on it. So I haven't really got any kind of substantial academic books or articles that I looked at other than those resources for just kind of basic factual information. I'll just give a shout out to my own book, Dreams and Dreaming in the Roman Empire. Why not? But you're probably more interested in creepy classics, ghost stories from ancient Rome, which is cheaper, and also fiction rather than slightly dry academic history. So buy that one now from Amazon. You can also check out my YouTube channel, Classical JG. I have new videos going up weekly, most of the time. This one is horrendously late. If you're watching this on YouTube, I apologise. Life stuff, I'm sorry. Generally speaking, I try to get new videos up weekly. You can find me on TikTok as well under @ClassicalJG, and I am on Threads now as ClassicalJGH. I will be back with a new episode in December. It'll be something either Christmas or Yule or winter related. I haven't chosen the story for it yet, but I usually try and do something relating to the season for December. And until then, take care of yourselves and have a happy Halloween! Creepy Classics was written and performed by Juliet Harrisson. Music composed and performed by Ed Harrisson, with vocals by Olivia Knops. It was produced by Juliet Harrisson, with assistance from Newman University.